Thank you, Melissa, and thank you all for being here. And I want to thank Esther and Sasha and Gail and everybody who's contributed to today. It's going to be very interesting. We are going to start the panel with a few explanations. We were asked to look back as far as we could on the history of support for artists in this country. And it's obvious why we were asked to do that, because we're the oldest living people in this community.
Watch what you say.
And I know that's true in part because one of the ideas that we came up with in designing this panel was to do a timeline of support for individual artists in the United States. And Ted suggested that we start with marching bands in the Revolutionary War. And
I remember.
I was just going to say, we were part of a drum and fife corps. He played the fife, I played the drum. We go back that far. But I hope you'll take a visit on this timeline while you're here today, because it was a fascinating thing to try to put together. It's obviously just for people's perspective and incomplete, but we tried to tack down the dates of important fellowship and award programs and residency programs, the start dates of those, important policy events that affected artists, including the Social Security Act of 1933, as well as Obamacare. Important intermediaries, national and regionally significant intermediaries that have been part of this work, and research papers and conferences that have propelled the work. So there are pens attached to the wall. Add and amend as you see fit. It's just a work in progress. And similarly, we also put up the list of all the members of GIA who make grants to individual artists. And part of GIA's continuing work to know more about its membership, we would ask you to look for yourself on that list and to put a date by the, indicate the date when your program for artists started, so that we can continue to build up this history. But that is a brief introduction. Our purpose is to review the roots of artist support in our country and its evolution over the course of time, and to talk some about how we see the case for support for artists evolving, and some of the challenges that we've overcome and some of the challenges that we continue to see facing us in this work. You know these three people: Francis Phillips from the Haas Fund in San Francisco, Ted Berger, our own bar of artist support in America, and Cindy Garrett, president of the Jerome Foundation in Minneapolis. And their bios are in the packet, but I don't need to repeat them. What we're going to do is have two conversations. Cindy and Ted are going to talk a bit about the early history of artist support, and particularly some of the challenges to getting that started. Francis and I are then going to have a conversation coming somewhat closer, really from the cultural wars forward. Then I'm going to interview them about what they see as the primary outstanding issues still confronting our work. And then we're going to open it to a conversation with you. So we hope in 75 minutes or so we can cover a lot of territory. So with that, I'll pass it.
Good morning. It's nice to be here today with all of you. Ted and I both started our careers, our labors of love in this field in the public sector. So we thought we'd begin there, because some of the concepts and policies and values that have been so important to us came out of that public sector experience. So I'm setting it up for Ted to speak a bit about those early years, particularly of the NEA and state arts councils, both some of the challenges and the opportunities that they faced. After a few years in the public sector, I moved to the private independent foundation sector, but Ted has been in both fields for many, many long years.
Thank you. Participating in the Scratch Orchestra reminded me of those marching bands and the revolution. And I find it so ironic that we're talking about public support at a time that we're on at a standstill. Maybe we should take our instruments and start marching now, once again. So, in the beginning, I assure you I really wasn't there for all of it, but Cindy is right that we came into a field at a time when a lot was happening. It was building on things that had been put in place. Certainly the WPA program was an extraordinary program in which artists benefit, but was really designed for all citizens. And as Holly mentioned, depending on your political point of view, what the Social Security Act did, particularly in terms of unemployment insurance for artists, is probably this country's most important government subsidy for artists. But it's really with the development of the state arts agency movement that, while there were earlier private sector initiatives, I believe that the whole idea of supporting artists across the country began to move. In 1960, the State Arts Council of New York, NISCA, was created, and 5 years later, the Endowment grew. There was historically a sibling rivalry between the two. I was a pilot project for the Endowment and the State Arts Council. I was the first statewide artists in schools coordinator. But gradually...
And I would like to say that that's the field I also started
Right.
in. I coordinated the Artists in the Schools program for a state arts agency.
And as this program grew, it had both interesting delivery systems, because it was a national program being delivered with state and local initiatives. But the arts department really began all over the place. When as Cindy and I were talking about, at the very first meeting of the endowment, without a panel process, they gave fellowships to artists. Merce got a fellowship. In 1968, I believe, their fellowship programs started. The 70s was really I'm not of the quill pen. In the 70s, when a lot of stuff happened today, Nelson Rockefeller in New York was becoming vice president. And literally, he said to the executive director of the State Arts Council, "What would you do with $30 million?" And at the time, Rockefeller had a kitchen cabinet of bipartisan brain trust. And one of those people was Henry Allen Moe, then of the Guggenheim Foundation. And he said, "You cannot support the arts without supporting artists." And so with that 30 million, NISCA and the state of New York literally spawned a variety of organizations that we take for granted now. Poets and Writers, Meet the Composer. There was an organization called CAPS, Creative Artist Program Service, which was the first time public monies were used for any form of a state fellowship. And that had a public service component to that. And then the New York Foundation for the Arts was one of those organizations spawned at the time. The Artists in Schools program began to spread all over. And then the next big piece, and I'm sorry he's not here, because we owe John Kreidler an unbelievable debt of gratitude. Many of you know John. He was here many, many times. John was an intern at UCLA at the time, having previously had experience at OMB. And he saw some legislation called CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. And he said, we can do something to support artists. And in San Francisco, they started a program directly supporting artist jobs for 125 artists. 3,000 artists applied. This idea spread like wildfire, I mean, across the country. Because it was a way, unlike WPA, which was nationally administered, this was determined locally by states and local governments. And so strong proposals and advocacy efforts could make things happen. CETA, on an annual basis then, was $300 million a year, which is now tantamount to $800 million a year, going from 1971 to about 83, 84. In New York City, we were embarrassed because we couldn't get the act together the way the rest of the country was doing it. And I know this very well because in my living room, we created, by batting political heads together and putting a united front as an arts community, we created a $6 million CETA Artist project, which employed over 300 artists. So NIFA was very involved in all of this. And then in around 80, 81, 82, the state decided to make a change in the fellowship program. CAPS was over and NIFA was selected to take on the fellowship program. At the time, I started to make calls all over the country. Who was doing what? NASA didn't know. Endowment itself didn't really know. And I remember at the time, I wrote a letter to Frank Hassel. I was submitting the proposals saying, "Dear Frank, this is what NIFA needs." Then I had the audacity to say, "This is what the country needs." And it was the idea of having a conference to bring, for the first time, public and private funding to talk about supporting individual artists. That conference took place in '86 in Montauk, vowing I would never do it again. We did it in '88 at Orcas Island on the West Coast, which Ann Folk coordinated. Out of that grew a whole bunch of things that some of you may remember. In '88, we received $1 billion from the Endowment for a national coalition for individual artists of 7 states. Again, the idea of a national initiative that had a local, statewide initiative. And the Arts Wire grew out of it, and actually what became this pre-conference grew out of it. So as these things were going on, the private sector really started to grow as well. And Cindy, who's far more expert at that than I, is really going to fill you in.
I'll try to speak loudly. Can you hear me in the back? You want to try in the back? Is this better? Good. I was going to say that I'm used to speaking loudly. I live with a husband who's deaf in one ear, and I yell all the time at home. I have to say things 3 times, so the terrible existence. I want to take us back to 1925, the year that the Guggenheim Foundation was set up, because if you're looking for the source of private sector funding and what still continues to the present day, I think that source is the best one. When the Guggenheim Foundation started, the idea was that it would invest in individuals, not only artists, but other types of individuals, and they would build the power and the brain trust of the United States, and that these people would be required to go abroad, not only to bring U.S. culture abroad, but to bring the cultures they experienced elsewhere back to the United States. And I think today we've lost a lot of that spirit. The impetus, I think, for many of the early projects was an evolved form of patronage. When Ted and I talked yesterday, we spoke about the fact that even from the get-go in the public sector, artists usually had to give back They had to do some form of community service, some engagement. In the Artists in the Schools program, we had to enforce a 50-50 split so that the schools didn't encroach on the artist's time to do his or her own work. But in the private sector, the source for much of what we're doing today was really an evolved form of patronage. I want to talk about one of the first press releases that the Guggenheim Foundation issued after it started funding artists. The foundation desires to do for young artists and scholars of America, in some measure, what the great noblemen of the Middle Ages, or more recently, certain European governments, did to foster the flowering of genius, namely to give men and women of outstanding talent the leisure to devote themselves to their work. I think many of our programs are still informed by the idea of genius or questioning the status quo or artist as community leader. We're still invested to some degree, I think, in the nature of individual power, agency, leadership, commentary. So that's part of our history. I looked at the 1976 report of the Bush Foundation, located in St. Paul, which started a very early artist fellowship program that many of us have followed, and they were very helpful to me. Their mission was to enable selected artists to devote concentrated time to their work and to increase the quality and pace of their artistic and career development. Again, artist-centered, and the value was that artists were special people to be supported. I think our discourse has changed somewhat comparing then to now, in that we tend to be, our language tends to be about how the individual artist contributes to a dynamic, evolving culture. It's what Jerome says, and certainly McKnight's Artist Fellowships: the arts cannot flourish or advance community life without the ideas, energy, and drive of individual artists. An artist cannot make these contributions without unfettered creative time. So we're contextualizing the artist's contribution. What I loved about looking back in the Guggenheim history was that they had 900 applications in 1925, the first year of operation. And by 1928, they'd started using peer review panels, not only of peers, but also experts in their field. So they started some of the things that we're doing today. Jerome Hill started the Jerome Foundation in 1964. For the first 5 years of the foundation, for the 5 years previous to that, he, as a patron, chose artists he wanted to support based on the advice of colleagues in the field. Jonas Mekas at Anthology Film Archives fed him the names of film and video artists for decades, and he would send them monthly checks. Then along came the Tax Reform Act of 1969, which said, you can't do that anymore because people are paying favorites, they're giving money to children of friends, corporations are funding children of employees. So we began a series of rules that make our selection processes now more objective and less affected by bias or other agendas. So that's part of our history, that IRS and tax reform process. I thought I would also mention that in 1951, the Guggenheim Foundation was in court because the IRS required the recipients of their fellowships to declare that as income. And they saw it as services provided to the foundation by the artists. We're still arguing those cases. Maybe we're not in court today, but we're still dealing with IRS representatives constantly on what's taxed and what's not taxed. So that history comes to the present. I want to close our part today. Ted and I had 3 things that we wanted to talk about that seemed to us as continuing concepts. And I'll take the first, and maybe he'll take the second and the third. Nello McDaniel years ago did a chart for me that I think is still very much in my mind. I use it almost every week when I talk to artists. You put the artist in a circle in the middle, and the spokes of the wheel come out of that. And artists have agency. They have a way of making a life for themselves based on multiple support systems. We are only one of those spokes. Family is a huge spoke, unemployment insurance, work in their field, work in other fields, artists in schools programs, residencies. That whole spoke, that whole array is what an artist has to manage each and every day, which is pretty remarkable when you think about that. Ted?
I mean, that Nello's work and the domains of the investing in creativity, if you think about that whole ecosystem in which artists work and live, is important. I think for me, one of the big issues is what do we really mean by artist support? And how do we put a grant program in perspective? How often can artists reapply for programs? Are we really thinking about lifelong issues? By and large, I see the arts support system in general about two things: making work happen and bringing that work to a public, to an audience. The whole human needs issue is kind of left out there. And while the non-arts world may have mechanisms for that, as we know, it's been very difficult for most artists to access that whole other part. So what do we really mean by this? And what kind of skills and professional training do people need to have a life in this field, especially if income from one's work is always what it is, except for a few superstar artists. The other issue which really bugs me is what I would call the culture of inadequate compensation for artists. There are many funders, the balance between artist support, supporting artists and organizational support is ridiculous in terms of the percentage. But at the same time, how many funders really ask their organizations, what are you doing for artists? How much money do you give to them? Are you exploiting them as independent contractors when in fact they should be employees? This is true of both public and private funders. Similarly, artists are embarrassed to put in their requests for support the kind of money they really need for their project. It's what they hold back. So we have this culture of inadequate compensation, in my opinion, going back to this 19th century idealized view of the artist who's very special, not necessarily dealing with real world issues.
Okay.
Thank you both. How many people in this room were working in this field in 1990? And how many were not? Raise your hand. So about half and half. Francis and I are going to bring us a little closer to contemporary life and really start with the 1990 period, which was, it was the period of the culture wars, or anyway, the start of really intense culture wars. Started or precipitated by a number of decisions made by the National Endowment for the Arts to withdraw or deny funding to artists whose work was deemed too controversial for public support. And I think if you look at that chart over there, you'll see the chronology that Ted describes in the growth of public support for the arts, starting in 1960 with the New York State Council, growing with the Endowment, the state arts councils, the regional arts councils. That hit a wall in 1990 and has really been declining ever since. And in response, in my view, there's been a growth in the number of private initiatives, not only private foundations who've come in to support individual artists, but a whole array of intermediaries. They're the pink ones over there, that have stepped up at the local, national, and regional level to support individual artists. Francis runs one of those initiatives, the Creative Work Fund, at the Haas Foundation in San Francisco. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions about your view of this history and how you, since you've been at the fund, I believe it started in 1994, what do you see as the trending themes in support for individual artists, particularly from the private sector?
Listening to Cindy and Ted, I was feeling that the culture wars were less of a break and more that there was in fact great continuity from whatever our origins are to what happened after the culture wars. I just, in a capsule, say what the Creative Work Fund does, and shout out to Ann Carlson and John Rubin, who've both been recent panelists for the Creative Work Fund, and that's what gives it some integrity, is having great panelists. But we were designed kind of just after the culture wars, and there were two urgencies on the minds of the people who designed the program. One was the 1989 earthquake, which caused many cultural funders in the greater Bay Area to invest in construction of buildings or repair of buildings. And the other thing was the culture wars, and the argument being made that artists did in fact work, their work had value, and their work had value in a lot of different settings. So what's maybe going back to origins, or maybe was distinctive, was that artists have incorporated
making art with people, but not, but for that to be their project. So one of the trends I've seen has to do with artists wanting to bring additional voices in as essential content for the work that they are making, or making work with people, as opposed to, this is my life over here in a remote location, that in fact it has meaning because other people are engaged in the doing. That's part of the genesis of it. And I think that I had an assumption sort of early on in the Creative Work Fund that the artists who might best address our guidelines were artists who were relatively mature, because they would know who they were and what they did, and they would be at a point in their lives where they were willing to give over and exchange and kind of work in new ways, and they would not be in that mode of becoming. But in fact, it's turned out to be a model that is quite good for younger and emerging artists as well, who didn't have quite the same assumptions about, I'm going to do my work in the community versus I'm going to do my work in a studio in an academic setting. But I feel as if those worlds had become pretty porous for a lot of artists. I think the Nell McDaniel model was something that a lot of artists were assuming, as opposed to, I'm going to spend my life in my studio and then make it bigger and not. So that's one of the things that I saw. But Holly, what would you say? Because if you're asking that question, I bet you have something top of your mind.
Always. It was really fascinating to do this timeline because it's my history in part, going back to 1776, but particularly to 1975, which is when I joined this field. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was the decline in interest in international work. That Cindy talked about it as being an element of the Guggenheim Fellowships. Certainly it was key to the Fulbrights. And there was a great deal of attention put on international exchange in the 80s and early 90s. But to me, that it's in keeping with America's increasing isolationism in some ways, that we no longer have things like Arts International and a variety of supports from the U.S. State Department and others really promoting a kind of cultural exchange which was fundamental to early parts of certainly my experience in the arts, and critical to artists who need to be stimulated by and interact with people from all over the world. Another thing that came to me powerfully as I was doing this timeline is to think about how we have evolved our arguments for artists. I think there was a powerful call to recognize artists as doing legitimate work following the brouhaha in the early 1990s. But I do think that we've also seen a growth in thinking about the artist as a whole citizen, a player in multiple dimensions of community life, and as a contributor not only to artistic life, but also economic life and social life of communities. And I think in initiatives, in a variety of different kinds of initiatives around the country, from the work that Maria Jackson did on the Investing in Creativity study and the following link, Leveraging Investments in Creativity initiative, in projects like Project Row Houses in Houston, which started in 1985, I believe. There's a growing sense that artists have agency in their community, and we need to recognize all those dimensions of their work. So I find that a fascinating trend as well, which may go back all the way to the earliest days, but is certainly more prominent now.
The other theme, or another theme that I think has evolved over time since the time of the origins of the Creative Work Fund, and it's somewhat represented in the new issue of The Reader, is the artist as having a particular mode of inquiry and research into the work that they do, and the embrace of the idea of the creative community, and giving back a certain sort of intellectual style and manner. And I think that was one of the thoughts at the founding of the Creative Work Fund, and I feel as if this is a thought that is more top of mind now, is that in our thoughts, the foundations were always wishing that nonprofit organizations would collaborate with one another, and it's extremely hard for them to do so because they spend a lot of time distinguishing themselves from one another. But artists, in fact, are very good agents of collaboration. And what are some of the skills that artists have that they must have to survive and do their work? And how can that be brought into other settings of revitalizing the way, recognizing the way people think and do and work together? And so, I think that echoes your thought about the citizen artist. I'm thinking a bit about Ted's comment about the level of support, because our particular grants are project grants. They're $40,000 grants. The rule is that 2/3 of the money is supposed to be paid to the artist, either cover his or her direct expenses or be paid to them. And I think we imagined that artists would be paid about $20,000 or $25,000. And in fact, the average has been more like $13,000. And they have shared the money with other artists. They spent more on material supply than travel. And I just think I got a final report from Philip Congo Tunde, and this is not calling him out for any. This is calling him out for praise for having the courage to say this, which was, when are funders going to think about what it actually takes to live, a life in a major metropolitan area? Like, if I were in another field, you'd be thinking about paying me $100,000 to spend 2 years on something. And I think that's really a fair question, that we keep anticipating that artists will constantly give and give and give, and that it somehow will lose some of its integrity if the level of support is too much, or there's this, even among those of us who are trying to do something, there's this anxiety about what's appropriate.
I remember when Maria Jackson finished her study of artist support systems in 2003. One of the things that we were able to do in that study, based on NIFA-Source, the compendium of information about awards and residencies and programs available to artists that the New York Foundation for the Arts built and still sustains. There were something like 1,500 programs and services for artists in 2003. I think the number is up to 1,800 now, but in 2003, that represented about 4% of grants and contributions going into the arts, the nonprofit arts sector. 4% of, now many artists are paid by arts organizations that get grants from foundations, et cetera. We know all that, and we weren't able to chart that. But the idea that just 4% of available philanthropic dollars are going directly to individuals was shocking then to me, and I'm not sure it's any better now, although we haven't the data to actually do that analysis, and I know that will be part of our conversation later today. Another thing that I think is sort of embedded in some of this history and raise a question for all of us to think about today, which is the sense of a national community of funders and the sense of collective action. I mean, I think in the last 10, 15 years, with the exception of a few initiatives, we have seen a pulling back on thinking about research together and acting together to make more of the sum of the parts. There are any number of continuing programs, initiatives started in the 80s and 90s, National Performance Network being one, where a variety of national funders contribute to make something possible nationally that has local impacts. But I think that I worry that there isn't a sufficiently robust conversation going on at the national level to say, how can we make more of the sum of the parts in addressing issues of concern, pay rate being just one. So were there other observations you wanted to make?
Well, I'm interested in thinking a bit about who's getting left out. And walking over here with Alan Brown today, and I don't know that this is a community where there's a great amount of need, but Alan has just been to Burning Man, and you can ask him about it, and that's an enormous investment of money in art making, and a lot of things being done for free, and I don't know that any of us are supporting that, and maybe it doesn't need it, but it's become a very influential thread of art activity certainly in California, and it's not kind of coming through whatever systems of support. I feel as if, at least in our region, but I think it's spotty across the nation, the folk and traditional arts field, design, which is robust, just kind of like who's not currently getting to the table. Have we recreated a system of cronyism? You know, how are we opening the door? That's mine.
That's a perfect segue to an opening. What are the remaining issues and what do we want to challenge each other to think about? So Ted, I can see that you're very eager to get. Yeah. You have things to say.
I'm champing at the bit on this one. The issue of equity and I think increasingly class issues are raising very, very serious questions about who's being left out of this picture. I mean, it's gone on in the arts for a long time, but I think I've written about it, and I don't know what to do about it. As increasingly the academy is becoming an important feeder system in this artist development process, as the academy becomes less affordable for people, and as even access to the academy from, in many places, the majority culture, what does this mean in terms of who's not even in the pipeline, especially when most of the grant systems, not all, both public and private, tend to use the jargon and an understanding and the skills that come from what you learn in the academy. It isn't that self-taught artists or community-based artists don't have the talent. It's they don't have those skills. So what are the implications of this? Where might the community college system fit into our thinking about this? I don't think these issues are just arts issues. I think they are true about many other sectors as well. But this issue of equity and class within communities of color, for example, or immigrant communities, there are some people, obviously, that have resources to play the game, but there are too many who are not even on the radar screen.
I wanted to add a comment about permutation and proliferation. We started with some models that we've talked about here, but there are probably 2 or 3 different types of artist funding programs at each of your organizations, or maybe 1 or different avenues. And what's been exciting to me is how we've taken the idea and we've changed it a bit, tweaked it a bit. Sometimes it's based on what we understand that our region or our city needs that doesn't fit someone else's model. Often it's what we can get our board to agree to. And it's usually based on our own experience in communities with artists and talking about what they need. So what I've loved is all the different permutations that we make on the model. And one of the things I was particularly liking about the new Doris Duke program is that it brought to the forefront things that I hadn't thought about for a while, and that was retirement, and how one builds capital to last a full productive life. I think that's really intriguing. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the idea of selection has been really interesting to me, and how we've adopted different ways of getting at that, whether it's a panel, a nomination system, a hybrid system. And I think our most effective partners over the years have been those nonprofit organizations, most of them artist service organizations, who've helped us do our work when we don't have our own tax-exempt ruling to give grants directly to individuals. I mean, you need to get a pre-approval to do that if you're a funder in the private sector. So think of all these partnerships with organizations that have made our reach to individual artists possible. I'm thankful to them, because not only do they distribute the funds, but they provide services and networks and professional development activities that our small staffs couldn't do on their own.
I wonder if each of you would opine a bit about how the world has changed. When some of us came into this field, it was sort of like an open field. In other words, there were relatively few programs, there were relatively few organizations, there were relatively few struts, if you will, trees in the filling the meadow. 25 years later, 35 years later, it's now quite cluttered. There are a lot of programs in every community in this country that are supporting arts organizations and artists. Maybe not enough, but there are a lot more than there were, which has changed the ecology, in my view. And in my dotage, I think it's time for us to step back and say, okay, if we were starting again now with the resources that are arrayed around the country, what would we do? What are the questions we should be asking now about the way the field operates? Because not only are there an array of nonprofit organizations, there are also now commercial entities and hybrid organizations and all manner of electronic mechanisms that are supporting and fundamental to artists' work. What is it that we could do to detach ourselves from our investment in our current structures, to think again about what is needed and where we could make the big change, the big leveraging investment? So, Frances, what would you say to that?
Oh, I was thinking of an answer to the first part of your question. So can I answer that, and then I'll get somebody get someone with the vision over here on my left to say what we need. But I was, in terms of the world changed, I see, and this speaks to Ted's comment about the college access system as well. You know, I was a poet who accidentally got trained in grant writing, and because the ladder was so short, I was directing a nonprofit organization about 5 minutes later. And it was that kind of artist-run organization, the idea that I would have needed to get a master's degree in arts administration, I would have thought that was pretty darn silly. And that, so I think that the artist-run spaces, which, and thank heavens there are vital ones that are sustained, but I think that's a big difference in the landscape. And then the other thing that I think is a healthy difference in the landscape is the number of artist support organizations, Creative Capital being an example, sort of the Center for Cultural Innovation, where the idea that you're giving artists some skills to maintain, control their destinies and to be able to market and understand their work life as part of their art making life. I think that's been that's been a profound and healthy change in the system. So the idea of helping them to be self-determining as opposed to just waiting for somebody to come with a nice check. So I'm going to pass it down for the vision question. Maybe I'll think of a good, what if we started over?
I'm old, I'm not sure my vision's like, but it's a very tough question. One of the things, and I'm glad it has surfaced, you know, I've always been an anomaly in this field. I've given away millions, but I've had to raise it. And it was very controversial about whether I would even be allowed to attend GIA for fear that I'd have my tin cup out all the time. But what I'm very grateful for is that the role of intermediaries has surfaced. I don't think, in fairness, that we are looking hard enough at how vulnerable many of those intermediary organizations are these days. And for those organizations that don't, those funders that don't support artists directly but support organizations, it's really important to look at the whole incubation system and the importance they are in the disciplines, in geography, in ethnicity, the whole range of things. Because so many of them came into being because of public money and have been dependent on public money with kind of nickels and dimes from the private sector. So that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of this looking at the ecology, I'm struck by the number of times we've kind of used the word whole. We see the artist as a whole citizen, and we want to look across sectors. The need to look at the artist as a whole person, not just as a maker, but as a human being. I'm not sure we've looked at this whole system. I think we're still stuck in a lot of 19th century ideas. I'm all for retreats, and I'm all for, but the lack of a comprehensive support system that we've really thought through is something that I think is important. What's complicated is when some of us came into this field, it was almost, it was an Edenic moment. It was the post-60s. With a nickel and a dime, you could change the world, and we thought we really were doing it. In a sense, it's like after the fall, and we're kind of struggling for what are our next steps, and I'm not sure where the leadership is these days. The world was smaller when I started, so you could have conversation. I don't necessarily I see incredible leadership in individual initiatives about artist support and other things as well. But this whole need to look, to be engaged in a national conversation about where we're going with this, I'm not sure where that is. And the difference, and I think this is the hard thing in the field, when many of us came into it, it was like, oh, well, government has the answers. They have this vision of what might happen, and we, like artists in schools, so they said do this, we follow. In many ways, government certainly doesn't have the answers at any levels, a national, a state, federal, local. There's some, but the experience is now in the field. So how we build that is critical to this dialogue and making sure that we're at the table, that we bring people who are not part of the dialogue into it. It's not a clear vision. It's more of a process, I think, to emerge something else, like something that works.
Watch out, Ted, you might have to run another orchestra conference. Right. Cindy, what's your... All right, well, I think it's on.
Yeah. Huh. Okay, well, we'd like to open it up to you. Maybe we can start with this conversation or this question about where is the national conversation? Do we even need a national conversation? But we're interested in your reactions to some of the things we've said or additions to the long arc of artist support in this country that you'd like to make. Would anybody like to jump in? Yes. Could you identify yourself and stand up and shout?
Stand up, shout. Joe Smoke, City of LA, Department of Cultural Affairs. I would love to see another timeline that does a similar thing for the commercial sector and how it supported artists. Because you keep saying things like internationalism is waning. Well, as far as I know, jazz has been big abroad since the 1930s. It's one of our great major exports as an American society. And artists, musical artists in particular, are touring more than ever now because it's how they make their money as opposed to selling records. So it would do us a good service to see the ebbs and flows of commercial funding artists. I just think that sometimes it's good to compare ourselves to another stream, because if we're just talking within our own stream, I'm not so sure we're going to really see with clarity.
I think that's really an important point. We threw this together in the last 2 weeks, and it's very flawed. Unions aren't on here, for example. And actually, there's probably a whole other category of hybrids, sort of the quasi-commercial, quasi-nonprofit entities that are springing up more and more now. Yes?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Carrie Adams-Hapner with the City of San Jose. And in that same vein, I just wanted to inject one more thing that I think is important to the timeline, because I think it's important public policy, and that's the proliferation of Percent for Art programs at the local level and also at the state level. And I think some of the outcomes associated with those public art programs are really the way in which artists are working now, because you're seeing that it's the artist as designer that's working alongside architects, engineers, also as artists as community activists, somebody that's in the community. Maybe I should just abandon this. But I think that's an important piece of this conversation. I recognize that those are not grants, but they are, they're like project grants in some ways. They're scopes, they're contracts for services. But I think what we've seen as a result of that is that artists are, completely have been liberated in a lot of ways to do new things in our local communities. So I just wanted to inject that into the conversation because I think it's been very important and it's an outcome of the WPA that you had mentioned.
I just want to comment, though, about a national dialogue. So, when Joe spoke about looking to the commercial, what it did was trigger the conversations we need to have amongst ourselves in terms of the creative community, whether you're artists go back and forth between this for-profit, not-for-profit. But I think one of the important moments that we're in, and I actually believe the Affordable Care Act allows that, and this came up in an early study that Artists Trust was doing. Claudia, where are you? About health insurance. the workforce of the future is going to look much more like artists do. Multiple jobs, episodic income, independent contractor thing. I think that's a rich dialogue for looking at where we fit into the spectrum, because if I remember the study in Washington State, it was like in some ways the arts community and artists have solved some of the problems that other people are facing for the first time. So I think there's a broader conversation, both within the creative communities, but about work in general. I sound like a community organizer. I wish I were.
Okay, I'm MK Wegman with the National Performance Network, Visual Artists Network, and we're based in New Orleans. I have two comments. One is the point of view that was raised earlier about the value of the National Endowment for the Arts being a national program that responded to local and regional initiatives, and that was its benefit. And then when it declined, the fact that private foundations stepped in, and we see a great proliferation of opportunities. Well, they stepped in where they were. And there are many, many, many places in this country where there were not foundation resources to step in, and which are still great deserts of support for artists and artist projects. And so my corollary to that is why we have abandoned support for the National Endowment for the Arts, because as a field and a sector, we have walked away from that political fight and have left it behind. And I think it's really time for us to value a national perspective, because there was a value system that was established at the national level that validated artists in a way that has never been replicated.
Hi, Susie Circumer, South Arts in Atlanta, Georgia, and I wanted to piggyback on what MK said and some of the others, et cetera, about the national conversation. We work a lot with organizations that are not in major metropolitan areas in the South, and nonprofits are struggling with how to be involved with individual artists. And so the idea of a national conversation that can involve not just the major urban areas in our country, but all the areas and all the types of arts organizations that can help with this issue is a prime concern. And certainly not everybody can get to a national conference, but we do have technology now that can help people participate.
About the national conversation, maybe I'm just feeling crabby this morning because I haven't had enough coffee. I think to the answer to the question about the reason we've abandoned the NEA is because the grants are so small, and when we lost general operating support or unrestricted support for artists, with everything you've got on your plate, the possibility of a $10,000 project grant isn't worth time, energy, resources, et cetera, for many people. That said, you know, before, when it was seasonal support or when it was unrestricted support, that was critical money you could build in your budget. Now it's the serendipity of the gods, and with everything you've got going on, with all due respect, with the urgency of the world, it's less a priority. And so my own sense about the conversation would be, until we reframe the agenda of what the NEA stands for and the way and what it's designed to do, people aren't going to rally behind it. And limping along in a weaker version of what it was is probably not compelling. All that said, now that I'm off my soapbox, the one thing that I found most interesting at this year's TED conference was the speaker who said, the nation state is over. The future is about the rise of the city. And he said, basically, if you want to solve climate change, national governments are mired in debate and they're never going to move the needle. Cities are changing it. And as a national funder, I've found myself more and more just saying, is really the future of arts funding really going to be at the city and local level? And what does that mean for this national conversation? The national agenda leadership may be over in terms of setting an agenda top down. It's a distributed model of leadership maybe. That's a different dynamic, which leads me to my question in a roundabout way, which is, if we basically were to take the viewpoint that things that we see in the larger environment outside the arts often determine our destiny. You know, so the whole idea that, for example, when we dropped away corporate responsibility, when we basically adopted market economics as the determinant of value, and then we see that. I'm curious from the panel, what's the single biggest issue we should pay attention to now in the non-arts context that will determine what we will be doing in arts funding 10 years from now, from your point of view? So we're not just playing catch up within our own field.
From my point of view, it's new forms, particularly digital forms and communication, and the use of those forms by artists, not only to present their own provocative works, but in exploring new ways we connect with one another. Face-to-face is always going to be important, but I think our future lies in a blending of that with new media and an understanding about how information and content is digested, shared, debated.
It's like being on a jury and listening to what Ben's charge to the jury is. There's a nuance to it that I'm trying to, it's the non-arts. And I think I said it earlier in the sense that I think what's happening to workers in general, the kind of independent worker, whether they see themselves as creative worker in the cultural economy or whether they see just, you know, ordinary workers. Artists are like the factory workers in Detroit. You know, the issue of makers needs to be thought through. The non-arts part as well, and so it's related to that. Particularly as, Ben, you talked about cities. I love this field. I'll die with my boots on, but the tensions exacerbated by the culture wars between organizations and institutions and the needs of individual artists in an advocacy system are palpable. In the city of New York, where there are so many artists, there is no program except for the Percent for Art program that funds artists. That has to do with 19th century, maybe 18th century ideas about how public money should be used. But if we're not at the table about artists' needs, how can we be within the arts, how can we be at the table in this kind of broader discussion with the non-art sector about workers?
Ben, I think you're asking a question that is at a kind of a bigger frame than my answer is going to be, but the thing that came to my mind was some thinking about what makes good youth development, and the conversation about how young people who are cyber natives, what you need to do to help them learn and mature and become confident adults is that you sit down with them and your conversation is not about, let me invite you into this structure, but what are your questions? What do you want to find out? And then you connect them with people and tools that can help them find that learning is not so much about memorization, it's more about how do you get to the information you're looking for. I think, and I would say that the program that I run and love is guilty of this, is when you ask artists what they intend to make, they have to be pretty far along in making that very thing before they can give you a really convincing proposal for it. And if you could work with them in a way in which You're asking people whom you inherently trust to have integrity and intellectual curiosity what they want to find out, and it's more open-ended, that you would get to a more interesting result, that you wouldn't get the answer they already know. So
I think inequality, climate, and metrics are the things that we need to be paying attention to. Inequality growing globally, putting many of our fundamental values at peril, putting our democracy in peril, in my view. I think it's number one on my list. Climate, it's going to swamp everything else. It's going to take all the resources. And then metrics. This is ill-formed, and Alan can take me to school over lunch about it, but bear with me for just 1 minute. And this, I've been thinking about this before I did this timeline, but the timeline reinforced it. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and capitalism with a capital C won, and there was no alternative political philosophy any longer viable, even though communism persists, in my view, it speeded up an obsession with return on investment consciousness that is perilous to happiness, equity, fairness, and a lot of things, other things that at least I care about. And I think it's been particularly damaging to fields like ours which are basically in the business of spirit. How do you measure spirit? How do you measure awe, transformation, any of that? So I really think that there needs to be a new conversation about what we are mapping, what matters, and how we catch that information, not only in numbers, but in other qualitative metrics that draw us back to happiness in the Jeffersonian sense, the satisfaction of living a life complete and contributing to one's community. So. You've already had a chance, but we'll come back to you later. Anybody? Oh. I need a chance. Okay. Okay. Other comments or questions that you want to put to the panel, and if not, we'll hear from Roberto, and then we'll take a break. Yes, Magda. It's coming your way.
All right. Okay.
Yes, my name is Magda Martinez, and thank you for having me this morning. I am not a grant maker. There are a couple of thoughts, and I've been sitting trying to figure out if there's a thread through all of them. I can't quite get it, so I'll do my best. So this idea, I think someone just talking about equality versus equity, and I think for me, equality implies same for everyone. You're splitting up a pie evenly. And I think more, for me as an artist, lately I've thought more about equity. That if you want to, and I think this goes toward engagement and finding self-taught artists, that you may just have to invest in some people a little more for a longer period of time to actually get them to the place of being equal, right? And that to me is about equity, not equality. So that there's some thoughts there, I think, that could be interesting for artists, but also for funders in terms of how they're thinking about this and how you think about who's at the table and how you're going to get people to the table. I do believe that community-based artists have both skill and ability. They may not fit the model and the mold they're being asked to articulate those skills and abilities in. So I'm also a writer, so language means a lot to me. If you look at proposals, those questions are framed a certain way, and they often don't ask you to bring your whole self to a proposal, to discuss your whole self, to discuss process. You pretty quickly have to get to project. What am I giving you money to do, right? And I think people articulate those differently. Their cultural backgrounds lead them to make work differently. their experiences in the world, their socioeconomic class, all of that comes to their thinking and their words. And so I think as an artist, and also I've realized as a writer, I have no doubt that my chances of getting a proposal are sometimes much greater than my counterparts who are dancers, who are visual artists, because they are also being asked to articulate their ideas and their work in a very fixed way. I love words, I think about words, I want my words to matter, but if I were a dancer, and I talk this way too, and I'm not holding a microphone, I actually do things like this and say whatever that means. I don't know what it means, I can't say it in words. And so I think also just thinking about how we are being asked to present ourselves is really key here, and the flexibility. How risk adverse are we all at the moment? And how willing we are to open that, I think, is a question we can all ask ourselves that may bring us to some answers. Because as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, well, what if you ask artists, how would you create something? And I'm trying to avoid the word institution. How would you create something that would allow you to do your work and make your life? It may not actually look like the institutions we have now. And so I think someone mentioned Holly. One of your points might have been, well, you know, how are these structures? What are these structures? Well, how far are we willing to go to disassemble those structures to really reflect how people might do their work? I come from a very communal background. It makes sense to me that my work is not divorced from my people. It's an odd thing for me to think that way. So people might want to put me in the community-based artist category, but I may not identify that way. Because it is so inherent to who I am. I'm not thinking I'm a community-based artist. I'm thinking I'm an artist informed by the millions of things other mainstream artists are informed by. So I hope there's a thread in there somewhere. There you go.
Hi, I'm Tripita, and we have two artists speaking in a row, so I don't know what that means, but I'm also a writer, and I share a lot of the same thoughts that Magda expressed. But I also want to talk about something Ted mentioned about the intermediaries and the organizations. I'm a full-time artist, full-time employee, also a part-time employee, and I have been a teaching artist and a number of other things. In terms of and I also worked for many nonprofit organizations. So as that intermediary, those organizations, when we're talking about trends and what's important for grant makers, I think it's really important to establish some type of standard for contracting with artists. Because I find that that's a piece that could vary. And it's important that what you said, I consider myself pretty proactive and strong in going after, but at times you are sometimes reluctant to say when you're being a contractor or working for an after-school program or artists in residence, arts and education, often you're a little reluctant. You don't know what's being offered. And again, I'm a person that will speak up. But a lot of the organizations, these intermediary organizations that are being funded, I think it's good to establish some type of standard. To say, although people do submit budgets and they tell you what artists will get or not receive, I think it's important to say, we're hoping or we want the artists to have this. And I think as a grant-making organization, metrics I think are extremely important, but I also think it might be good to establish those standards as a group, a range or something that is acceptable, because there are some things that are clearly unacceptable.
I'm a visual artist. I'm also chairing arts administration program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I wanted to respond to the thread of the speaker before the previous one, talking about the gesturing. One of my strands of research has been what critique is all about as a way how artists are actually communicating as a pedagogical form. And what I have found is that I find it best defined by it being performative. And as a performative, combative game, it is very constructive and allows people to actually work on site and establish ideas very, very different from academic speech. And that is something that I also find in what I'm doing for this conference later on is I've made a diagram of interviews I conducted with artists on the request of 3 arts about grant making. And so one big request I found from the artists was if we could just speak to people in person, if we could just be there on site and present ourselves in full, communications would change. So that goes in with your question of saying, what if artists can reinvent the forms in which these communications are being made? And then just on a third very brief note, when I'm going up for grants and I can make personal representations, it tends to go really, really well, even though the writing is also fine. So it's something that might be considered in general. Thank you.